The Grenfell tragedy exposed a building safety crisis that's been affecting hundreds of thousands of people across the UK. And yet, 7 years on, many are living in unsafe flats or have been left homeless with nowhere to turn. The cladding crisis continues and is having a devastating effect on the physical and mental health of its victims. So why are so many people still at risk? And why are the governments so slow to respond? Well, I'm Charlene White, and this is what you need to know. Hello and welcome to today's episode of What You Need to Know. I'm joined by ITV News Social Affairs correspondent Sarah Corker. And Sarah, you've been investigating the cladding crisis across the UK for ITV News. So can you talk us through, give us a sense of the scale of the issue that we're facing at the moment?
Hi Charlene. Yeah, the scale of this crisis is enormous. It is ongoing, and for the thousands of people caught up in this, there is no end in sight. Many of them have told me over the years that I've reported about this that their lives are on hold, they're paused, that they feel powerless really, because nothing seems to be happening. They're just stuck in these buildings that are unsafe. Now, if I give you one example, across Greater Manchester, more than a third of high-rise buildings have some kind of fire safety fault. So that number is huge, and they're not getting fixed, and progress is just so slow. And actually I've seen official documents showing that 150 of those buildings in Greater Manchester are actually so dangerous that special measures have been put in place to try and keep residents safe. So they include things like fire wardens who patrol the buildings day and night to make sure that safety is, paramount, and to keep residents safe. And can you imagine living like that for residents for years and years and years? And this is a scenario that's being repeated in towns and cities across the UK, and this crisis isn't going away.
I mean, so many of us remember those pictures of the Grenfell Tower tragedy, and it just seems unfathomable that 7 years later, the progress is still so slow. Why?
Well, the background to this is really important. If I just remind you, it was actually the flammable cladding that was wrapped around Grenfell Tower that caused the fire to spread so rapidly. The fire engulfed the building within minutes. Now, in the aftermath of Grenfell, in the years that followed, the tragedy exposed decades of failures across the construction sector. So there were checks on buildings across the UK that had similar cladding on, and basically what it showed was there was a range of faults, not just dangerous flammable cladding, but other issues like missing fire breaks, flammable balconies, defective fire doors, all sorts of things that were just built incorrectly and that put residents at risk. And this is the result of years of deregulation, of cutting red tape under Labour and Conservative governments. And those in the building sector, in a way, felt kind of untouchable, corners were cut, and the end result is this huge building safety crisis. And it's a complicated web of blame, and for years, 7 years since Grenfell, there have been disputes really over who should pay to fix these buildings, and in the meantime thousands of leaseholders are just waiting, stuck, unable to move, unable to sell, unable to get on with their lives.
Now, you've spoken to quite a few people as part of this investigation. You spoke to somebody called Fozia, who had to move out of her accommodation in Oldham like 4 years ago because it was deemed unsafe, and she's not been able to move back. And she's one of thousands of others who are in a very similar situation.
Yeah, that's right. And since Grenfell, it's actually estimated that 15,000 residents in high and mid-rise blocks have been forced to leave their homes due to either a fire or defects that have been found. And new analysis for ITV News has shown that in the last 3 months alone, 600 people have had to evacuate their homes. And Fozia's story is particularly heartbreaking. She was given just 24 hours to leave her two-bed flat in Oldham. And that was nearly 4 years ago. I met her this week. She's in her 40s. She's working 2 jobs to help pay the bills. She's living in a student hostel at the moment. She's paying £500 a month for a tiny room, no carpet. She's sharing a bathroom and a kitchen with 20 other people. She's doing laundry in a bucket, and at the same time she's still having to pay for that flat in Oldham that she can't even step foot in. And she told me that the stress of all of this is having a huge impact on her mental health.
We all are suffering mentally, physically, financially. We are broke. Because of their negligence, we are nowhere. And who is going to be responsible, and who is going to take the responsibility? As I know, it's like a blame game. For me, it's like I'm in a cave without light, without any hope. So every day I cry. I go to work 7 days to meet my ends, and at the same time I cry every day when I come home and I don't see the way my lifestyle was.
Financially then, how much of a strain is that on you?
It's too much. In one point, to be honest, it sound maybe that I'm covered, but I'm not covered. In one point I really wanted to took my life.
Really?
Yes, I've been through that stress.
They've talked about the financial impact on Fozia, and she isn't the only one, as you've inferred. And you've also spoken to someone else who had to move out of accommodation in Salford under very similar circumstances and hasn't been allowed in.
Yeah, and this is a different situation, but I think it illustrates the many layers to this cladding crisis. So there are 9 blocks in Salford. They are owned by the council. And after Grenfell, the dangerous cladding was removed pretty quickly. And at first, residents felt really relieved. They felt reassured that they were safe. But then they were left. The cladding wasn't replaced. And what this material actually did was it retained heat. It acted as insulation. But the block's just been left like a building site. There is no insulation on the block at all since 2020. And what that means is every winter, when temperatures fall, residents say they are freezing. Their energy bills are enormous. I met Eddie Farrell this week, who showed me around his property. His building is surrounded in sheeting, in scaffolding. There's very little daylight, and it's making him miserable. He also showed me the ceilings on all of the floors have been stripped because they wanted to put in a sprinkler system. It's been like that for a year. There are wires hanging down all over the place. He feels unsafe, freezing and miserable. Have a listen to what he's got to say.
Yeah.
You can't really see out of those.
No, it is a building site, but for the tenants it feels like a living hell. It's dark, it's damp, it's cold, there's wires hanging down everywhere. We just feel abandoned.
What effect is this having on your health, Eddie?
I've had 3 heart attacks while I've been in this block. It's stress, yeah, a lot of stress.
Yeah, he talks about the health implications there. Now, let's look at these figures. An estimated 3.2 million people are struggling to sell their flats because of cladding issues, many of whom were told that mortgage lenders would help them on cladding-affected flats. So has that actually happened?
No, in many cases. And I think, again, the issue is that until this remediation work is completed, many of the buildings are unsellable and often valued at zero, so it's difficult to get a mortgage. And when there are disputes around who will pay for the work, that just causes delay after delay. And over the years, I've spoken to many families who have simply outgrown their flats. When they purchased them, for example, there were maybe a couple. Since then, they've had children, they've grown, their families have grown in size, but they're still stuck in some cases 1-bed flats, cramped, overcrowded conditions. They've described themselves as mortgage prisoners, desperate to move on, but they just can't. And all of this affects, of course, confidence in the housing market. Often these types of flats are the first step onto the property ladder. That rung of the ladder, is being blocked. People just can't move on. But also, being a leaseholder in one of these buildings isn't particularly desirable at the moment, as you can expect. So there's then not the demand for these flats, so it's difficult to sell. I think all this illustrates just the knock-on impact that this is having across the housing market. And another leaseholder I spoke to in Leeds actually told me, she's so fed up of not being able to sell her flat or move on. The building have taken the developer, the building owner, the freeholder, all of them, to court to try and get them to do the work, to get it completed so that they can sell and move on. Still, nothing is happening. They're just waiting. Again, these feelings of just feeling completely powerless, that is something that is reiterated time and time again when I meet these people across the country. Yeah, it's a really, really difficult situation for so many people.
Because they're feeling stuck, and for a lot of them, they're still at risk. You know, you talked about Fozia, who's got those financial implications. You've talked about Eddie, who has both physical and mental implications in his case. And there are so many more people like them. So what does the government have to say about it?
Well, I think for Fozia and her situation, one of the things that's causing the most impact for her is she's still having to pay £4,000 a year in service charges for a flat that she can't even step foot in, and that is just breaking her financially. Eddie's situation is slightly different because obviously he lives in social housing. He just feels like he has no control over his life. The work just is taking far too long to complete. He is just stuck there, and it's having a huge impact on his health. So we put all of these issues to the government, raising these concerns, this feeling that people across the country just feel completely abandoned. And the Housing Secretary, Angela Rayner, has said it's just not acceptable that so many buildings still have unsafe cladding. The work isn't being done quickly enough, and she's personally promised to put pressure on developers to carry out the work needed to make buildings safe. She's written to local leaders in areas where there are a large number of buildings that are affected to say, you need to have an action plan, you need to put pressure on the freeholders and the building owners to do the right thing. Now, the government has also set up a number of funding schemes to help pay for this remediation work, for the removal of the cladding, and that's in a scenario where a developer or a building owner can't or won't pay. So there is funding there, but one of the issues is it's just taking so long to get this funding allocated. And again, if I point you to some official figures, it just shows you the glacial pace of the remediation work. So work still hasn't started to remove dangerous cladding on more than half of the blocks with known risks. And since Grenfell, nearly 5,000 buildings have been classed as having life-critical cladding or fire safety defects. That's nearly 250,000 flats. So these numbers are mind-boggling. It's actually difficult to get your head around them. There's just such a huge numbers. And actually, the figures show that every month, more buildings are being identified as having faults than being fixed. So this puts into context, really, the scale of the issue. The government say they're putting pressure on the industry to do the right thing. But, you know, speak to people stuck in these situations year after year with no end to this suffering, and they feel like progress is just far, far too slow.
All right, Sarah, thank you so much for talking us through that. Thank you. Well, for more on this, do head over to our website for more on the cladding crisis. And actually do have a look back through our other quick briefings on a range of headline topics to find out what you need to know. Until next time, thanks for listening.